Okay, welcome. This is Tougher, and this is the Philosophy of Religion, and we are going to talk about the question of life after death. Is this something we take on blind faith, or there are potential sources of evidence that we as philosophers should examine? So, that's what we're going to do today. Today is the 29th of March, 2015. Alright, we're going to talk about some introductory thoughts. Some students say they just don't care about this major existential question of death. But for me, that's hard to believe unless they're just not thinking and they're just consumed with sense experience. Give some of my thoughts on William Rose, Chapter 9. I emailed him a couple days ago. We'll look at some of the arguments for substance dualism, and these come out of the book by J.P. Moreland and William Lane Craig, Philosophical Foundations for a Christian Worldview. Then we'll talk about Christian philosopher Richard Swinburne, some of his views. We'll look at the potential evidence from near-death experiences, where people think they've gone on to heaven or hell or something else. And then we will look at J.P. Moreland's evaluation of near-death experiences from his book Beyond Death. And we'll give you this and that. Alright. So, briefly, if you've seen Guardians of the Galaxy last summer, 2014, I enjoyed the heck out of that film, and I think I saw it 3 times this fall. Thanatos is a Greek god of death, kind of a minor character, but Thanos is this major villain that Marvel has shown us and will show us more in the coming years. So, Thanatos, that is deathless. Remember, one of the marks in ancient Greece of being a god is being a deathless one. Nathaniel Hawthorne said this: "Our Creator would never have made such lovely days and given us the deep hearts to enjoy them unless we were meant for eternity." Now, this is an important question to ask, and I think there is some of this evidence. C.S. Lewis, Peter Kreft, K-R-E-F-T, and other philosophers throughout history have given kind of these existential arguments that we are just, there's more to this life. Last night on Coast to Coast, George Norrie, they had a guy who was a physicist talking about the multiverse, and he gave this argument from justice. And his view was the fine-tuning of the universe shows us this universe is designed. But you know what? The fact that it is not just that a small child can get sick and die, or infants die of SIDS, and then you have somebody like Hugh Hefner live out his Playboy fantasies in the grotto until he's 150 years old. Come on, how is this fair? And so some people argue on this justice kind of objection. You know what? We are meant for more. So you do what you want with Nathaniel Hawthorne's quote. It's something to think about. Alright, Sir James Frazer said this, quote, "Of all the many forms which natural religion has assumed, none probably has exerted so deep and far-reaching an influence on human life as the belief in immortality and the worship of the dead. Hence, a discussion of this momentous creed and of the practical consequences which have been deduced from it can hardly fail to be at once instructive and impressive, whether we regard the record with complacency as a noble testimony to the aspiring genius of man who claims to outlive the sun and the stars, or whether we view it with pity as a melancholy monument of fruitless labor and barren ingenuity expended at prying into that great mystery of which fools profess their knowledge and wise men confess their ignorance." In the second Indiana Jones film, Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom, Indiana Jones in the opening scene, his Chinese partner gets shot, and he says these words to Indiana Jones: "I go into the great unknown first, Indy." And so, yes, this question of death has plagued humans forever. We know it from anthropology, from our music. You just watch any Hollywood, all these Hollywood films. All right. Now, this is Peter Kreeft. This is what he said in the book Love is Stronger Than Death. And so, yeah. Have you heard people try to comfort others by claiming something like, "Oh, be comforted because so-and-so will go on living in our hearts and minds and memories forever"? Now, most people hear that and are like, you know what? That sucks. That's horrible. That's not comfort. Because just living on in your memory, that's not real continued existence. You know what I mean? It's one thing for me to continue to exist, or just I'm dead, I don't experience anything, and then I live on in the memories and pictures or a monument, uh, like Abraham Lincoln. And the late Louis Poyman, who is acquainted with the truth of death right now, bless his heart, he says this. He was at West Point. He said, quote, "Being immortal is not simply a matter of living on through works or in the memories of our loved ones. Rather, immortality involves freedom from death." So actually persisting after your body decays. Quote, "To be immortal is to be the sort of being who will never undergo the permanent cessation of one's conscious existence." So, in Poyman's sense, this is going to eliminate most forms of Hinduism and Buddhism as truly being immortal, where we either are absorbed into God, or in Buddhism, the third nirvana, where we cease to exist and have any kind of consciousness. So, here we have, who is this? Can you guess? Who went to Sunday school? That's right, King Solomon. Ecclesiastes, let me read just some of Ecclesiastes 1. "These are the words of the teacher, King David's son, who ruled in Jerusalem. Everything is meaningless," says the teacher, "completely meaningless. What do people get for all their hard work under the sun? Generations come and generations go, but the earth never changes. The sun rises and the sun sets, then hurries around to rise again. The wind blows south and then turns north. Around and around it goes, blowing in circles. Rivers run into the sea, but the sea is never full. Then the water returns again to the rivers and flows out again to the sea. Everything is wearisome beyond description. No matter how much we see, we are never satisfied. No matter how much we hear, we are not content. History merely repeats itself. It has all been done before. Nothing under the sun is truly new. Sometimes people say, 'Here is something new,' but actually it is old. Nothing is ever truly new. We don't remember what happened in the past, and in future generations, no one will remember what we are doing now." So, ask yourselves this question. Do you know what your grandfather did for a living? Do you know where he lived? Places he lived in his life? What about your great-grandfather? Do you know where he was born and where he lived and what he did for a living? Maybe? What about your great-great-grandfather? If not him, your great-great-great-grandfather. What is the point? Your great-grandkids, maybe your great-great-grandkids, or at least it's going to be 2 or 3 or 4 generations, maybe more now that we have, if we don't destroy ourselves with nuclear war, EMPs wipe out all our data, we're just not going to know what happens in 3 generations. So, what are we living for? What's the purpose of life? If in death, it's just done. So I love the existentialist in King Solomon, where he's really wrestling with these big existential questions of death and meaning and purpose in life and this kind of thing. He goes on. So I came to hate life because everything done here under the sun, or while we're living, is so troubling. Everything is meaningless, like chasing the wind and the futility of work. I came to hate all my hard work here on earth, for I must leave to others everything I have earned. And who can tell whether my successors will be wise or foolish? Yet they will control everything I have gained by my skill and hard work under the sun. How meaningless. So I gave up in despair, questioning the value of my hard work in this world. Some people work wisely with knowledge and skill, then must leave the fruit of their efforts to someone who hasn't worked for it. This too is meaningless, a great tragedy. So what do people get in this life for all their hard work and anxiety? Their days of labor are filled with pain and grief. Even at night their minds cannot rest. It is all meaningless. So I decided there's nothing better to than enjoy food and drink and to find satisfaction in work. Then I realized that these pleasures are from the hand of God. For who can eat or enjoy anything apart from him? God gives wisdom, knowledge, and joy to those who please him. But if a sinner becomes wealthy, God takes the wealth away and gives it to those who please him. This too is meaningless, like chasing the wind. So, get your Bibles out. You could steal one the next time you stay in a hotel. I was a housekeeper, so I know. The Gideons put those in hotels for you to steal. So it's not really stealing. You should take it. And read this from Ecclesiastes 1 and 2. You guys are a little young, but Dave Matthews Band, Tripping Billies, good song. So, yeah, it was about an experience he had on LSD, but he also quotes Solomon, eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die. The prophet Isaiah quoted Solomon as well, let us eat and drink, for tomorrow we shall die. And Paul, writing to the Las Vegas of ancient Greece, Corinth, he wrote this. And what value was there in fighting wild beasts with people of Ephesus, if there will be no resurrection from the dead? And if there is no resurrection, let's feast and drink, for tomorrow we die. So, if there is no afterlife, this really bothered Paul. What are we doing? Why am I risking my life to spread this news of Jesus if there is no afterlife? So, what do you think? Tell us on the discussion board. Do you agree or disagree with Paul? Alright. I hope you see the importance of this issue. I always have students who just don't care. I don't get it. I don't think they're thinking enough or struggling enough, or maybe they're not old enough. Last week I had dinner with my first kiss, known her since third grade, and the girl who hooked me up with my first girlfriend in seventh grade. We had dinner, and our talk was, we're having our 25th reunion this summer, and the talk was, wow, our friends are dying, heart attack, and it's scary. So we talked about death for a good 30 minutes, and we had a little debate about, do we die alone, or do we die with others? People are in the room. Anyway, Gladiator. I love this film, and I love the thanatology in this film. So if we live on past this life in a heaven or hell, or if we are reincarnated, or if we are absorbed into the one, we want to know, because our deeds may echo in eternity. Now, I love this film. I love the end song, Now We Are Free, by Lisa Gerard. It's fantastic, I think. So we want to know, because our view of death will have an impact on how we live. Our actions may have an impact on our fate in the afterlife, since we may be morally accountable by God or the law of karma. Meaning and purpose in life, one of the other big existential issues. If our deeds echo in eternity, then we have lives of drama that's unimaginable. We get to play a part in this cosmic drama with God. In Sunday school today, we taught kids how Jesus washed the disciples' feet. Easter's this coming weekend. Today was Palm Sunday. But he was a true servant. And if Christianity is true, Jesus invites us into the greatest drama, that this life is not just, an accident. We are part of a cosmic drama that God invites us to be his hands and feet, his soldiers, to spread goodness and the texture of the kingdom of heaven uh, of love, truth, and beauty to everything we touch to stamp out evil. So that's exciting if we aren't just blips on the screen, but we're actually immortals who are fighting for eternity in this cosmic drama. So yeah, there's no such thing as an ordinary life if this is the case. And if you've seen Lord of the Rings, Return of the King, or read the Tolkien books, I love the Return of the King and just seeing those guys sail off and having them reflect on what a dramatic, awesome life they had to be used for the good of Middle Earth. All right. So I do think, like Samwise Gamgee and Frodo thought, yes, we do have lives that are worthy of writing huge epic songs about. So we may have something to live for, a battle to fight that's greater than anything of which we can conceive in ordinary life. That's why this is important. So I do think these books are rich and that they reflect a type of reality that could be true if there is an afterlife. I dated a woman who called this the bore of the rings. Forget her. It's worth reading or watching the films. If we were in class, I'd do this with you. I'm not, so you can post your thoughts on discussion board. 1. Imagine that there is no life after death. Would you live your life differently? And what would change? Secondly, imagine that there is life after death. What would you do differently and why? And 3, what about people you know who live their lives in light of either belief? With eternity in mind or no eternity in mind? So, those of you writing a worldview paper, these are helpful questions to get your thanatology down, your philosophy of death, and how it relates to your ethics. All right. Ask your friends too. How in the world can we discover the truth of the matter? Maybe there is no truth of the matter. I mean, maybe it's just difficult to tell, and maybe it's just everything accepted on blind faith, which is a popular view out there. But let's not be that skeptical just yet. Let's look at these different sources of evidence. This is how to proceed in my view. First, I think we need to consider the philosophical arguments. We need to do the metaphysics of human persons. Are we more than just our brains and bodies? Do we have some non-physical component to us? Do we have a mind or a soul that's irreducible to neurons firing, brain states, and so on? Okay? Are we the kind of things that could live on after death? Or are we completely physical beings? We want to know that. All right? So, Aristotle said the intellect, the part of the soul, operates without a body, so that at least potentially could survive bodily death. So that's a debated topic. But also, very interesting is testimonial evidence from near-death experiences. So near-death experiences are not almost dying. Near-death experiences are a special kind of experience where you actually are technically brain dead and you have experiences that you should not have given that your brain is not working. So we need to ask, are any of these legitimate? And if so, they may establish that life after death occurs at least for a few minutes or the length of the longest near-death experience. Some have tried to say, well, if you meet other people in eternity in heaven in a near-death experience, maybe you can stretch the afterlife from the time the people you see when they died until that moment. That's a question. And third, revelatory evidence. This includes arguments for God's existence. So if God exists, if we have good arguments for God's existence, so far this semester we looked at the Kalam cosmological argument, we looked at the fine-tuning argument from physics, we looked at the moral argument for God's existence, we looked at the argument from consciousness or mind, the noological argument, and so on. And if those are stronger than the problem of evil, then God's existence might be more probable than not. And so I think that should put us on the quest to see if God has spoken in history through various prophets. We want to know if that's true. And if more information has been given through mouthpieces of God, namely prophets, or if God showed up on this planet, him or herself, in the form of a person, like Jesus. Alright. So, if God exists, did he or she speak and give knowledge to persons about the afterlife? In other words, is there some form of divine revelation true, or information from God? Is the Bible really information from God? What about the Quran? Are the Upanishads receptacles of knowledge from beyond? So if this knowledge exists, every human should hunger to get it. So we are existentially starving for answers about life and death and to find out if there's any meaning and purpose to our lives. So personally, if you don't care about these questions, that's something to think about. Pray the atheist prayer. God, if you exist, should I care about these questions of meaning and purpose and death and life? And I think, yes, these are the most important philosophical questions we can ask. Excuse me. All right, how to proceed. What we're going to do in this presentation, we're going to explore some of the arguments for and against substance dualism, read about near-death experiences, and ask yourself if some of the best ones are plausible. Now, as good epistemologists, we want to rank testimonial evidence. And so, some testimony is more reliable than others. If you've ever had jury duty, we can rank testimonies based on various criteria. And so, I've selected at least 3 that we can look at that I think are interesting and have the best chance of being true, or possibly true, or at least parts of them. Thirdly, examine arguments for God's existence. If God's existence is probable, then it is reasonable to examine the revelatory traditions to see if God actually transmitted information to humans. Now, I think we should start with Christianity. Even though I'm a Christian, I don't think this is biased because it is the best information if it's true. If God actually showed up and walked around and taught people things, we should go to that religion first before we go to a religion that just says we get a second or third hand from prophets. You know what I'm saying? So that's why we need to find out if God exists and if the evidence around Jesus' resurrection is reliable, that type of thing. William Rowe, he's an atheist professor emeritus at Purdue University. Chapter 9 in his text, Philosophy of Religion, which I've used for 9 years now in my philosophy of religion class. He goes over 2 views, Homeric view versus Platonic view. And Homer's view is not a very exciting existence. So in ancient Greek polytheism, gods and humans came into existence, but only the gods were immortal. Athanatos. As Homer said, quote, "There is still something in the house of Hades, a soul and a phantom, but no real life in it at all." And Homer's Achilles said this, "Let me hear no smooth talk of death from you, Odysseus, light of counsels. Better, I say, to break sod as a farmhand for some poor countryman on iron rations than lord it over all the exhausted dead." So I'd rather be a slave of a poor man in the middle of nowhere and barely surviving than to be king of all Hades. Now, this is very interesting because this view is not mentioned in the Apology when Socrates gives his death argument at the end. But this is something very much in the Greek consciousness at the time. So, yeah, Socrates' view was more robust than Hades, where he thought he could do philosophy and it would be a life of enjoyment for eternity. King Solomon's view was like Achilles. So let's go back to Ecclesiastes. He says this, "It seems so tragic that everyone under the sun suffers the same fate. That is why people are not more careful to be good. Instead, they choose their own mad course, for they have no hope. There is nothing ahead but death anyway. There is hope only for the living. As they say, it's better to be a live dog than a dead lion. The living at least know they will die, but the dead know nothing. They have no further reward, nor are they remembered. Whatever they did in their lifetime, loving, hating, envying, it's all long gone. They no longer play a part in anything here on earth. So go ahead, eat your food with joy, and drink your wine with a happy heart, for God approves of this. Wear fine clothes with a splash of cologne. Live happily with a woman you love through all the meaningless days of life that God has given you under the sun. The wife God gives you is your reward for all your earthly toil. Whatever you do, do well, for when you go to the grave, there will be no work, or planning, or knowledge, or wisdom. So, King Solomon's view was not positive. It was this unfun time in the afterlife. Psalm 6:5. For in death there is no remembrance of you. In Sheol, who can give you praise? Philip S. Johnson, in Shades of Sheol, argues in detail that the Israelites were not as preoccupied with the underworld or the dead as some claim. Instead, Hebrews believed that Yahweh was the God of the living and that Sheol was cut off from God. Yet, many had faith that God would lead them to a positive afterlife. Now, Jesus and the writers of the New Testament painted a different picture of the afterlife where work would continue for his disciples for eternity, where humans are free to continue to create in God's will, not just sitting on a cloud as the myth goes, but in a new heaven and new earth, where we're actually doing work with God, the true, the good, and the beautiful, and continually creating, growing in love and in wisdom. All right. Now, C.S. Lewis said something interesting. I read this 10 years ago, and he said this, that he admired the pre-Christian Jews for being as motivated as they were to serve God when there was no carrot or reward of heaven motivating them to follow God. Does that make sense? So he says, wow, you know what? These ancient Jews, a lot of them served God even there was no reward of an afterlife. They thought that God was the God of the living, and then they died, that was it. This was the Sadducees' view that some of the teachers that Jesus dealt with in the New Testament. So, yeah, that's it. And Lewis just admires it. He's like, you know what? That's cool. They're just going to the cliff, serving God, and then that's it. So what do you think? Do you think an emphasis on the afterlife of today's Christian churches produces people serving God for reasons less worthy than the ancient Israelites? Post your thoughts on the discussion board. Let's talk about it. All right? And give us some real data. Give examples of people you know from your experience in church, if you have any experience in the church. All right, so the Platonic view. For Plato and Socrates, the soul is immortal. We see this in the Phaedo. We see Socrates talk about this in the Apology, his trial. And, so persons are not their bodies, and the soul continues in the afterlife. Book 10 of Plato's Republic, we see this view of reincarnation of the soul. Where was I? I think it was at Coast to Coast last night. This guy gave a view of kind of like Plato's reincarnation view. But anyway, in the Phaedo, Socrates carries out the death sentence of the Athenian court by drinking the hemlock poison. And here, let me interrupt. Substance dualism is a view that there's two substances that make up a human being. So there's not just the physical substance or physical parts, there's also a non-physical soul or an immaterial soul or self in addition to a body. So substance dualism means there's a body and a soul versus physicalism where there's just a body. All right, Crito asks, but how shall we bury you? Any way you like, replied Socrates. That is, if you can catch me and I don't slip through your fingers. He laughed gently as he spoke and turning to us went on. Quote, I can't persuade Crito that I am this Socrates here who is talking to you now and marshaling all the arguments. He thinks I am the one whom he will see presently lying dead. and he asks how he is to bury me. As for my long and elaborate explanation that when I have drunk the poison I shall remain with you no longer, but depart to a state of heavenly happiness, this attempt to console both you and myself seems to be wasted on me. So, I listen for this language when I watch the news and I hear different things. So, sometimes I watch a lot of this stupid investigations, discovery, true crime, and it just depresses me. But anyway, so if they're burying somebody, they'll say, we buried her, but some people say, no, we buried her body. Anyway, listen for that. Are people identifying a body with who that person is? Or do they say, no, this is just her body that we buried or cremated, making that distinction? All right. The myth of we're not going to do this, but yeah. So his view of reincarnation and punishment. But in my class, my face-to-face class we're doing book 10 in a couple weeks here in Cincinnati. Xavier. All right. So read Plato's view, if it is a view of reincarnation, and see what you think. By the way, for the Greeks, spheres, like the stars, were perfect beings, and they thought that like is attracted to like, so we spend some time in the stars. And incidentally, this is why Plato thought human heads were round, to house a spherical soul, perfect entity. All right, back to William Rowe. The three differences. Unlike the Homeric person, the Platonic person is truly immortal. So Plato identifies the real person with the soul that occupies a physical human body. To Plato, life after death is viewed not as inferior existence, but as actually superior to life on Earth. Now let's do some other religions, the afterlife and Hinduism. Now some of the sacred scriptures of the Hindus, Upanishads, teach that reincarnation occurs until moksha, release from the samsaric cycle of birth and rebirth. I think I've got a diagram in a couple slides. But upon release, the soul Atman is absorbed back into God, Brahman, and loses all individuality and consciousness. So most Hindus, like Deepak Chopra, are pantheists and believe that we are all part of God at every second of our lives. This is the Shankara school of Hinduism. So there is no need to be absorbed into God. We wake up and realize we were God all along, and we are released from the illusion of birth and rebirth. So basically, on the Shankara school of Hinduism, this is we're all part of God. So when we're absorbed into God, we'll basically cease to exist as selves. And so the big illusion is that there's distinctions, that things are not God. And so now I should say minority views by Ramanuja and Madhva. These Hindu philosophers who lived centuries ago, they argue against Shankara, and they say that it's more of a classical theism. So there is a personal God, and we survive, and we're not absorbed into God. They're very different. And on my view, more hopeful. Whether or not they're true or not, you have to decide. So the Hindu view of the transmigration of souls at death from one body to another body. This is a view that reincarnation, which means literally being put back into flesh, of the individual. Now, Atman means soul or self. So they think that this occurs until the goal is reached, absorption into the impersonal God, Brahman from the universe. So the goal is to lose individuality and individual consciousness. Well, it's indirect effect of the goal of getting released from this endless cycle of birth and rebirth. Oh, and there's Ramanuja. Yeah, check him out. All right. On Buddhism, this view is that there's no soul, Anatman, no self, and no God. So there are very different views of the afterlife in Buddhism. Some believe in a pure land of heaven that some can dwell in, but Buddhists reject the concept of a soul or self, Atman. This is how they distinguish themselves from Hinduism. And they embrace the concept of no self, or Anatman. So Buddhists also deny that God, Brahman, exists, and that we are absorbed into God upon release from the samsaric cycle of birth and rebirth. So Buddhists believe, like the Hindus, that the goal is to escape the cycle of birth and rebirth, Buddhists and Hindus believe our individuality will be removed the moment of nirvana, but how it's removed is different. So Hindus and Buddhists disagree on how that individuality will be removed. Hindus think we'll be reabsorbed into God. Buddhists think we will cease to exist. So, this is the samsaric cycle in Buddhism. So, you have Yama. He is the monster of impermanence. He's gripping all of existence and the wheel of life. So these are all the different incarnations. You'll have to look on the interactive website, but you'll see all the different kind of beings we can be. Hell beings, deity, persons, animals, and so on. Different incarnations. Alright. Now to Christianity. 2 Corinthians 5, 1-10. Now, I think this lets us know that if this is true, and Paul had information from God, then we are not just bound by our bodily existence. He says this, "For we know that when this earthly tent," in other words our bodies, "that we live in is taken down," that is when we die and leave this earthly body, "we will have a house in heaven, an eternal body made for us by God himself and not by human hands. So we grow weary in our present bodies, and we long to put on our heavenly bodies like new clothing. For we will put on heavenly bodies, we will not be spirits without bodies. While we live in these earthly bodies, we groan and sigh, but it's not that we want to die and get rid of these bodies that clothe us. Rather, we want to put on our new bodies so that these dying bodies will be swallowed up by life." Now, some of you guys have permanent injuries, and the older you get, and the more injuries you get, the more you can relate to this. Wow, I'm sick of this body. I need something permanent and pain-free. Let's continue. 2 Corinthians 5, 1-10. Verse 5. "God himself has prepared us for this, and as a guarantee he has given us his Holy Spirit. So we are always confident, even though we know that as long as we live in these bodies, we are not at home with the Lord. For we live by believing and not by seeing. Yes, we are fully confident, and we would rather be away from these earthly bodies, for then we would be at home with the Lord. So whether we are here in this body or away from this body, our goal is to please him. For we must all stand before Christ to be judged. We will each receive whatever we deserve for the good or evil we have done in this earthly body." So, the Apostle Paul's view, we can see in this passage, is substance dualism. There are two parts to the human self. You have an earthly tent, and we're going to have a heavenly tent to house our self or soul or mind. So in Paul's view in 2 Corinthians 5, we are capable of living after our physical bodies are destroyed. And Paul says that disembodied existence is not a natural state, and our souls groan to find a new tent in the afterlife. So as Rose says, we are not whole until the resurrected body is united with the soul. The human person is viewed as a composite of body and soul. Thomas Aquinas, I have that here. Yes, here it is. So the final view Rowe mentions is similar to the Platonic view. This is Thomas Aquinas' view that the soul has a natural exigency to create a body and to use it to experience the external world. So this is also supported by Paul's letter to the Corinthians that a disembodied state without a tent of flesh is undesirable. So at the resurrection of the dead on Christian theology, the soul creates a new spiritual body, which, I am guessing, is using a new kind of physics in the new heaven or new earth. Most people don't realize that the Christian view of heaven isn't one of people sitting on clouds playing harps. It is a vision of new heaven and new earth, one that won't decay according to the second law of thermodynamics, where people will worship God and do fun work and be creative. So Thomas Aquinas' view from Aristotle, is one of two types of substance dualism versus physicalism. Descartes' view is that the mind is the only non-physical part of human beings, called Cartesian dualism. Most philosophers are unaware of the difference between these two types of substance dualism. To Rowe's credit, he does. And personally, this is my view. I've been convinced that the Thomistic Aristotelian view of dualism is true. but you be the judge. Let's talk about it on the discussion board. William Rowe's 2 questions. Number 1. Is the conviction that the human person survives the death of the body meaningful? Secondly, is this conviction about the afterlife true? So, is this question meaningful? This is the first question Rowe raised that we should discuss. I think his analysis of what a person is almost 100% right. He says that there are 5 characteristics of a person. Turn to page 150. I don't know if I have the link to the online PDF, but you can Google it, online PDF, William Rowe, and then skip down and find it. But here are the 5 characteristics of a person. Actions, intentions, sensations, emotions, thoughts, memories, perceptions, and physical characteristics. Now, personally, I disagree that the physical characteristics are necessary for a person or personhood, and Swinburne would agree with me. Why? I think that God and angels, if they exist, are persons, and God and angels, they don't have bodies. So, you can be a disembodied person, at least on my view, and most personal theists. In philosophy, we can use these kind of thought experiments to see what the necessary and sufficient conditions of personhood are. Conceivability, weak or strong, is also an important tool. So, conceivability, can you imagine this happening? So, when we look at near-death experiences, we're going to talk about conceiving of having our own near-death experience where we float around the emergency room, through the walls of the hospital, and so on. Alright, more commentary on Rowe. So personally, while I don't think that physical characteristics are necessary for personhood, they are part of our contingent reality. So I think that actions could be mental acts. For example, choosing to think about this or that, think about taking another drink of water, or dismissing thoughts after the initial pop into our minds. So I can think about pizza, but then I can dismiss it. So actions are not limited to physical actions. So I part company with Rose on this, that I think we can have free-willed mental choices, but you tell me what you think. Alright, can non-physical beings perceive or sense things? Is it conceivable that a non-embodied thing could have perceptions? So forget about whether or not it actually happens. Is there anything we know a priori about perception? Well, not that you can know anything a priori about perception. That would preclude disembodied persons, assuming they exist, from having sensations. In other words, could a ghost, angel, god, or demon, if any of these things exist, see a sunset or see a breakfast, a blood pudding, and grits you just made? If you live in England and you marry a Southern Belle. Alright, does this make sense? I put this in here in this lecture because I live with a guy, he got his PhD at UC, and he didn't think that ghosts could perceive because they didn't have brains. But it just puzzled me. I'm like, if non-physical souls exist, I mean, on Berkeley's view, we're all disembodied souls and there's no physical world. So there's nothing incoherent about a non-physical soul perceiving, even if there is no universe. Does this make sense? Anyway, this is why this slide is in here, because my buddy argued that ghosts or angels couldn't see sunsets or anything like that. Alright. City of Angels, by the way, tangent, Meg Ryan and Nicolas Cage, is a very interesting thing about the perception of angels. They don't perceive things like humans do. Alright. Hammonds versus Rowe's view of non-physical souls. So now, I think Rowe is absolutely wrong when he says it is not easily conceivable of how a non-physical soul or person could have perceptions. Oh, this is why it's in here. So, is it not conceivable that ghosts or angels, if they exist, perceive things? Also, what about humans in the case of near-death experiences? We're going to look at some NDEs, and even if all the NDEs are false, we can still conceive that such a thing is possible, that someone floats above the operating table and into the waiting room, or wherever. We just think it's possible. Like, if a Scientologist says I floated out of my body, or whatever, we at least know what he's talking about. A center of consciousness that can perceive that's floating around. All right. Or we could conceive of turning into ghosts ourselves, and we would still perceive, but we wouldn't have bodies. All right. We need to ask what we are conceiving of looking down at the person in the operating room. Is it a brain stuck to the ceiling? That's from J.P. Moreland. No. We are conceiving of a thinking and perceiving center of consciousness, an I or a self that has a sensation of seeing my own body on the table. Okay? So, is it... Yeah, we're conceiving of a thinking and perceiving center of consciousness. That is what the mind is. A unified self that acts, intends, senses, has emotions, thinks, remembers, and perceives. And when we are entertaining whether or not someone actually floated above the operating table through the floors of a hospital and over the roof of the hospital, what do we think is doing such a thing? Is it a physical brain that is stuck to the ceiling of the ER and a brain that oozes through cracks in the floors through a hole in the roof? No. We are conceiving of a thinking and perceiving center of consciousness, an I or a self, a me. That is what the mind is, a unified self that acts, intends, senses, has emotions, thinks, remembers, and perceives. So Moreland actually convinced me, yeah, even if all near-death experiences are false, we at least learn that, wow, what we think of ourselves as a self. Freaky Friday, those movies, are possible because we think of ourselves as disembodied or as substances. Philosophy for Dummies. I would get Philosophy for Dummies someday. That's Tom Morris's Philosophy 101 class from Notre Dame. He put into a yellow book. But get that, keep it as a reference. You can get it for less than $10 at a used bookstore. He explains materialism, dualism pretty well. And he gives some arguments for dualism in there. All right. The vast majority of philosophers today are materialists and physicalists. I have one friend with a philosophy PhD who's a dualist. Some of my professors from Biola are dualists, and some friends, but most of them are physicalists. All right. Some think it's a joke, and it's not even worth learning the arguments for dualism because nobody believes it anymore. Now, I think it's a horrible way to go about it, but there you have it. So, pause it and take a look here at what's going on. These are the two major views in the philosophy of mind. All right. Read these real quick, but the problem with personal identity is, wait a minute, if your body's always changing and you have a different body, what about you as the same as you were in kindergarten? How could I say that I'm the same tougher that I was in Mrs. Cox's class at Montfort Heights Elementary in Cincinnati, Ohio? How can that small 45-pound or however much creature that was just thinking about Star Wars and King Kong movies and Big Red Machine baseball cards, how can that kid be the same 43-year-old bald guy standing here now in Mason, Ohio? All right, what's the relationship between them? Now, dualism, they have a very easy answer to this question. You have the same soul. So what's the same about me is my non-physical self, or center of consciousness. I have the same soul from conception until right now. All right. Physicalists, people who are materialists, they have a harder time trying to explain what explains personal identity. Because this is going to be a huge question. Why should we jail somebody after every cell in their body is different 7 years later? That type of thing. All right. It's just a different human body. That type of thing. Can we punish something if it's a completely different physical state? All right. Pause it. Read it. You want. Why is this moving on? All right, the case for immortality. All right. Should be mentioned that there are a few arguments of Plato's Phaedo for the soul, but I wouldn't worry about those. there's much better ones out there. All right. Well, let's actually look at this one. Forgive me. So Aristotle endorsed this work in his book Metaphysics. So, quote, when the soul employs the body in any inquiry, it makes use of sight or hearing or any other sense, for inquiry with the body must signify inquiry with the senses. She is dragged away by the body to the things which are impermanent, changing, and the soul wanders about blindly and becomes confused and dizzy, like a drunken man, from dealing with things that are changing. But when the soul investigates any question by herself, she goes away to the pure and eternal, and immortal and unchangeable, to which she is intrinsically related, and she comes to be ever with it. As soon as she is by herself, it can be so, and then she rests from her wandering and dwells with it unchangeably, for she is related to what is unchanging. And is this not the state of the soul called wisdom? So here is this argument simplified. Premise 1. If a person's soul, while in the body, is capable of any activity independently of the body, then it can perform that activity in separation from the body. In other words, after death, surviving death. Premise 2. In pure or metaphysical thinking, contemplating the Platonic forms or ideas, like the form of beauty or the form of justice or truth, in their interrelationships, a person's soul performs an activity independently of the body. No observation is necessary for this investigation. Therefore, we can conclude a person's soul can engage in pure or metaphysical thinking in separation from the body. That is, it can and must survive death. Now, in one philosophy department I know, there's a logician who's a dualist. And I never asked him why he was led to dualism. But my guess is that maybe it's because logic is to be about real entities, real concepts that are non-physical concepts, and our thoughts are to be of these non-physical entities, then yes, we are thinking about things and describing things, concepts in math and geometry and logic, that are not physical entities. And these relationships between them, the greater than relation, the follow, the basing relation, P then Q, P therefore Q, all of these relationships and these relations, concepts and properties are very odd. They don't fit easily into a physicalist worldview. So what do you make of this argument? Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, and his view of the intellectual part of the soul, were onto something that humans take to be true. It seems that human activities are different from other natural activities of nature in our own bodies. So examples, free will to move our bodies, to free will to use, reason, and think, unlike a computer about whatever. We hold each other accountable for not reasoning well. We think there are intellectual virtues. Okay? So this assumes mental freedom. Oh. So if our minds are working independently of our bodies now, why couldn't they do this when the body ceases to be disconnected to it? So now we think disconnected from our bodies, even though we might correlate brain states with mental states. So if we can think now, why not after bodily death? What do you make of this argument? Evidence from near-death experiences. Remember that dualism is problematic for a naturalist. A naturalist is the form of atheism today, scientific atheism, most popular view of atheism in the academy and media today. All mental states have to be reduced to some kind of brain states. Functionalism, identity theory, or eliminated materials. So no thinking can be done without the brain. But if some of these near-death experiences are true, then some humans are having complex thoughts, sensations, and memories without any of the kind of the brain functioning. So if this happens, it is a serious problem for naturalism, because there are no brain states to correlate to mental states if you're a ghost floating around the ER. Does that make sense? All right, look at the argument on row, pages 151 and 152. Objections, we'll skip those here. Bertrand Russell, he gave a philosophical argument against. So the second main objection is from materialism. If materialism is true, a non-physical, immaterial, enduring substance does not exist. We are just our brains and when we go when our brains cease to function or rot. What do you guys think about this? Now, I do have some Christian friends and some scientist friends who are not dualists. So they're non-reductive physicalists or pure physicalists, whatever. And they have a zip drive theory or thumb drive theory. So they don't care. What they think God does is take a thumb drive and shove it into our brains and download all our memories and then creates a new body in the afterlife and just puts that thumb drive in the brain and downloads our memories. So classically, people who are physicalists tend not to believe in the afterlife, but there are some Christian physicalists that I know that think we're all just physical organisms now. That's how God made us. And when we die, God's just going to download our memories into our new bodies. There you have it. All right. It should be said that naturalism or scientific atheism rules the academy today. So only in the last 100 years has philosophical naturalism or scientific atheism had the weight of the culture behind it in the university. So before that, everyone believed Christianity was at least arguably true. So even if it's false, there are good reasons to believe it's true, and that it was plausible that life after death might occur. Now, naturalism is threatened if dualism is true. As Jaegwon Kim, a physicalist, has said, it is embarrassing to have these weird things in the ontological toolbox. So it's going to be embarrassing if you're going to be a consistent scientific atheist that believes the universe sprang into existence with the Big Bang and that we evolved with no help from a God, and so we are purely physical organisms. So if all of a sudden human organisms have non-physical mental states, it's a problem. So these philosophers know that minds and souls are much more at home on a personal theistic worldview. In other words, it makes more sense that souls or minds exist if God exists. Therefore, they have to be eliminated. So in my own view, the common sense description of our mental lives is dualism. We think we are the same person we were in kindergarten. Why? We're the same perceiving self that exists through time. We can describe our sensations, thoughts, beliefs, desires, willings. When we describe our brain states that are correlated with those sensations and thoughts, it's very different. The sensation of seeing red is very different than neurons firing in the visual cortex. All right. So, on my view, which was Moreland's view, physicalism, the metaphysical claim of naturalism, needs to be argued for. It cannot simply be assumed. If it's assumed without argument, we are in danger of dismissing important truths about reality, not to mention losing reason itself. So beware of people who only allow naturalistic explanations of phenomena and rule out all non-natural explanations a priori. Remember what Richard Lewontin said about how the a priori commitment to naturalism forces scientists and philosophers to ad hoc adjustments to their theories and implausible just so stories. Richard, he's a philosopher of evolutionary biology, and so he was pretty honest about this. If you saw my presentation on naturalism, if you assume God doesn't exist and that scientific atheism is true or naturalism, then you got to do a lot of gymnastics to try to make your theory work. That's what an ad hoc adjustment to your theory is. It's a scrambling to try to explain away some anomaly or phenomenon that does not fit well with your theory. All right. The objection from the bundle view, bundle theory of the self. Hold on a second. Let me pause. Read this. I try to pause. It's not working. All right. Bundle theory of the self. This is David Hume and the Buddha, though slightly different, but there is no I or self. All right. This is Hume's view, also held by the Buddha. In the bundle theory, there's no underlying center of consciousness or an I or self that has thoughts, sensations, or beliefs. His Holiness the Dalai Lama says there's a relative self, but it's illusory, it's an illusion. On the bundle view, there are just scattered thoughts, sensations, beliefs, but nothing has them. There's no owner to these things. So on this view, the Buddha called it the no self or no soul view, anatman. So if materialism or physicalism is true, then the bundle theory is true. Otherwise, as Edmund Husserl argued, it should be clear that the I or self exists as a thing that has mental states and physical states. When we refer to ourselves, we're talking about the I or the self that has a thought about math or love. We aren't referring to random mental states floating about. I am standing here. I have a pain on my feet. I have a sensation of hunger. I have a thought of, I need to go visit my grandma in the next half hour, and so on. All right. So this is going to be the objection the Hindus level of Buddhism. Buddhism, what reincarnates on Buddhism if there is no soul or self that is able to be reincarnated? So Hindus, on Plato's view and Socrates' view, reincarnation is possible because you have a non-physical soul that can survive bodily death and enter into different bodies. All right, philosophical arguments. Personally, I agree that this particular philosophical problem from Plato is weak, but for different reasons. Now, I think that Rowe's argument for materialism against dualism is supremely weak. I've already kind of commented on it. I had a guy tell me, this was 5 years ago, that, quote, the soul is the invention of man. So many people in the culture are unaware of the sophisticated arguments for substance dualism. All right, it's a common sense view, a description of our mental lives and selves, and it's a theory that explains personal identity and so on. So personally, I think that philosophy can show us that materialism and physicalism is false and that substance dualism is true, but you have to weigh the evidence and be the judge yourself. So philosophy could show us that life after physical bodily death is at least metaphysically possible. Does that make sense? If you could argue, like Aristotle did, wow, there's a non-physical intellect, so at least life after death is possible, because we're the kind of things that could survive bodily death. So whether or not it happens is another matter. All right. Edgar Vandy, you can read that in Rowe, C.D. Broad. But I have a few complaints about Rowe's book. I love 99% of his textbook, but I was disappointed that he's focused so much energy on the Vandy stuff and not near-death experiences. So that's why we supplement that with near-death experience stuff. So, all right. Pause it. If you want to go to the website and read it, do that. Basically, Rowe says, if it's reasonable to believe that God exists, then it is plausible that life after death occurs. All right? It makes it much more likely that there's life after death if there's a loving God who designed and created this universe. And just like the guy, that physicist I heard talking last night at Coast to Coast AM, George Norrie's show, Art Bell, he's like, yeah, this justice argument, it's not fair. So there has to be an afterlife. All right? So, and this is why I think that arguments for God's existence are so important. My personal justification. Now, philosophically, we can know that substance dualism is true on my view, and that it's at least possible that we, our immaterial souls, survive bodily death. Philosophically, I think we can know that it's more probable than not that a personal deity exists. Existentially, I think this can be confirmed through personal experience of this deity. I told stories this morning to my second graders in Sunday school about experience in camp, where this girl at 2 in the morning was crying. Young Life Camp at high school, and up in New York State, Lake Champion. Anyway, this girl was crying outside of the bathrooms, and I got up at 2 in the morning, had to go to the bathroom so bad, and so I went into the restroom at 2 in the morning. I see her sitting there, and we ended up talking for 2 hours. But she was like, She's like, I prayed so hard for somebody to talk to, and all of a sudden, I popped out of nowhere, and such and such. So I think we can have experiences of God, prayer, experience of worship, that kind of thing, but you have to do spiritual disciplines to open yourself up to those kind of things. But, all right. I think near-death experiences show us that life after death happens for at least a few minutes. For me, biblical revelation is the key. So if we don't have this, then we cannot know if we exist more than a few minutes after death. Now, of course, Plato and Socrates are going to disagree, but you be the judge. Since I think that it is reasonable to believe that the Bible has revealed knowledge from God, then we can know from it that there is life after death. So I think that if we don't have any form of revelation from God about the afterlife, then we do not have justification for believing in immortality of the soul. All right? So you be the judge. Maybe you can find other pieces of evidence that can show you without biblical revelation. Like when my grandfather died, like I remember we were working on he died back in 2002 in Cincinnati, Ohio, and we were working on his biography a month before. I remember he corrected me. My great grandpa had bought a bus, a Rio Speedwagon, and my grandpa started driving that to school, picking up kids at age 14 or 15, which is crazy. But anyway, I remember him correcting. He's like, no, that wasn't a 13-inch cow. That was an 18-inch cow on that Rio Speedwagon. And when I saw his body give out, I was like, you know what? This guy was not done living, loving, growing in wisdom, but his body's giving out. So this is a non-standard experience where I got that knowledge, but I was like, wow. I felt this in my guts that we're meant for much more than just these bodies. All right. The case against immortality. You can read this in Rowe. So Rowe claims that this argument is scientific in nature, not philosophical or theological. Read it. Basically, this is the physicalist argument. There's no evidence. And persons are not really persons. We're just objects of nature that evolve, that type of thing. Okay? So pause it and read this. McTaggart, he gives these arguments, and these are from physicalism. So that's why this whole mental processes and brain processes, this philosophy of mind, is important. Now, my analysis of this is that these are not scientific. These are philosophical arguments. So, on Russell's view of materialism, reason becomes hard to argue. Reason becomes an illusion. All right. So, I tend to lean towards libertarian agency, I believe in free will. And if we are just physical objects, physicalism is true. I think free will is impossible, and naturalists will say that as well. Ironically, William Rowe is the only naturalist I've ever heard of that believes in free will, even though he doesn't know how to explain it. All right. I'm referring here to this argument C.S. Lewis gave in his book Miracles, and Victor Reppert wrote a book, C.S. Lewis's Dangerous Idea. But basically, if we're just physical organisms, we're parts of nature. Other parts of nature don't reason. So how can we trust our own reason? All right. But the other point of this, Rowe makes this mistake. He says it's a scientific argument, which is really a philosophical argument. So we want to be wary of people who are disguising philosophy as science. All right. Oh, this is a scientific view. Wait, no. I think it's a philosophical view. It has to be analyzed. All right. So, personally, I agree with Rowe that, well, I'll skip this. Pause it, read it if you want. Arguments for substance dualism. I think I've been talking for hours. I got to give some Grandma a half hour. Philosophical Foundations for a Christian Worldview. You can find a PDF online or email me. I can send you this chapter. But here they go over 5 arguments for property dualism and the 5 arguments for substance dualism. I think these are very interesting, and every philosopher should know these arguments, even if none of them work. All right? So, yeah, the problem is most philosophy of mind textbooks do not explain these arguments. Since physicalism dominates the academy to the point where even top philosophers, they don't even know these arguments for dualism. As one of my buddies said to me, nobody believes that anymore. Why do we need to study it? Well, as John Stuart Mill says, you need to study your opponent's arguments better than your own. Why? In case you're wrong. So, physicalists, please study these arguments for dualism. Just like dualists, you should study the arguments for physicalism. All right. So, arguments for property dualism. Distinctiveness of mental and physical properties of states. This uses Leibniz's law to distinguish. Taste of Dr. Pepper is very different than the neurons firing, or the sensation of red has different properties than the neurons firing in the visual cortex. Self-presenting properties, that's Roderick Chisholm's argument. Subjective nature of experience. What it's like to be a bat. Existence of secondary qualities like redness, colors, tastes. Those properties are clearly different than physical properties of the brain. Charges of sodium ions, potassium ions, positive and negative are different than that. Intentionality, that's the ofness or aboutness. Nothing in nature is of or about anything, but yet right now I'm thinking of mints, I'm thinking of my grandma, I'm thinking of London, I'm thinking of Alfred Hitchcock. How in the world is that possible? Alright? So, pause it here if you want to read this. But this is basically the problem of consciousness. We mentioned this. So the noological argument, why does consciousness show up on brains but not on the bumper of my car, or on Mount Rushmore, or on my, this weight set over here? It seems strange. And the theistic explanation, I think, is more reasonable, but you have to be the judge. Let me mention the 5 arguments for substance dualism really quick. Our basic awareness of the self. This is Husserl's argument. He's like, you know what? I'm aware that there's an I or a self. So right now, I can make a list of all my mental states and all my physical states. And I can chart these as I go throughout the day. So I can pick 10 times throughout the day where I have different mental states and physical states. And the continuity is that I have the same self or center of consciousness that has them. So I'm aware that I am the same person, and for change to happen, something has to be the same, and that is me. I remain the same, even though I'm thinking about different things, I'm sensing different things, I'm getting fatter, getting thinner, and so on. All right. Secondly, first person is not reducible to the third person. Jeffrey Medell, he spends a lot of time on this. So, if physicalism is true, there's no such thing as an I or a self that exists. But we use this first-person indexical language all the time. So, in theory, it should be eliminated because there is no I or self. But how we use the word I, the first-person indexical, all the time, all day long. We use the indexical you, second person. You do this, you. So we're not talking about brain states or sensations. We're talking about persons or centers of consciousness. You switched bodies with me. It's Freaky Friday, Jamie Lee Curtis. Alright, you see what I'm saying? Perhaps. 3, personal identity through change. We already went over that. What's the same about you, kindergarten to now, if there's no soul or self? Alright? And free will, morality, responsibility, and punishment. If we have free will, then we have to have non-physical souls that aren't bound by matter. So physicalists don't believe in free will, except Roe, who can't explain it, bless his heart. But there you have it. So how does it make sense to punish somebody who is determined to kick that puppy? Why should we throw somebody in jail for kicking a puppy when he's just programmed by nature, his DNA and environment to kick that puppy. All right. And 5, physicalism and property dualism are self-refuting. Well, that should be modified maybe to be irrational belief. That's C.S. Lewis's argument from Miracles I mentioned. All right. So remember, though, even if substance dualism is true, life after death is not guaranteed to be true. Like Aristotle speculated that soul and intellect could survive bodily death, but he didn't say he knew for sure that it did. Now, Swinburne's relevant books. Is There a God? And The Existence of God. The Existence of God is distilled into the small book, Is There a God? There it is. I used that in philosophy of religion for years. Pick that up and read it sometime, and then email me. Let's talk about it. Near-death experiences. All right. Dr. Eben Alexander. This is a neuroscientist who's proof of heaven. Howard Storm is an atheist professor here in town, Cincinnati. Taught at Northern Kentucky University. Has near-death experience, and then got trained as a pastor and pastored a church in Norwood here in Cincinnati. So near-death experience is a purported out-of-body experience for someone who nearly died or was clinically dead and revived. It is not just a close call with death. So it's not, when I ran 9 miles in 115-degree heat in the Palm Springs Desert back in 2001 and called my mom, told her how dumb I was, I almost killed myself, but that's not near-death experience. And a month later, in 2001, I got caught in the Alps above Gimmelwald in a snowstorm wearing shorts. I thought I was going to freeze to death, trapped on that mountain for a couple hours. That's dumb, but I didn't have a near-death experience. All right. And then my 1977 Oldsmobile 98, I did so much dumb stuff in high school, I'm surprised I'm alive. But this stuff is not near-death experiences. All right, pause it here if you want to read types of death. All right. Clinical death, lower brain death, higher brain death, whole brain death, biological death, metaphysical death. These are relevant to really analyzing these NDEs. So read through this information. If you go to www.near-death.com, you can read about all this stuff. All right. So there's common aspects found in near-death experiences. They're not all uniform. There's some exceptions, but there's a lot of similarity. So we need to ask about those. Pam Reynolds, check her story out. Remember, we have to rank these testimonies. Some, if we can confirm, wow, her brain was totally on ice and not functioning, but how in the world did she hallucinate for 45 minutes and describe everything that was going on in the room in exact ways? That's kind of the stunning thing about her. We have on record her brain was chilled. But you decide. Howard Storm, his credibility comes from he was an atheist. He didn't believe in heaven or hell, yet he's in France and has this stomach experience, and then he thinks he dies and goes to hell. And then angels save him and takes him to heaven. So, what's remarkable about this, and it's more likely to be true than another near-death experience by maybe a Christian who believed in heaven or hell and just hallucinated, is that Howard Storm did not believe in heaven or hell, yet in his near-death experience he went there. All right. Now maybe it was false, but at least there's that initial credibility. Dr. Eben Alexander, he knows the brain. He's a neuroscientist, and what happened to him in his near-death experience, he says can't explain. And his proof of heaven. I think this is the second book, The Map of Heaven. All right. Gandalf's near-death experience, which is pretty bizarre. The beginning of the Two Towers, if you saw that, where he fought the guy. Was it Balrog? You shall not pass. And then they went into the abyss together. But he has a near-death experience. All right. www.jpmoreland.com. You can look up Moreland, my former professor at Biola University in La Mirada, California. You can look up his stuff. He's got his book Beyond Death, where a lot of this information is from. And Moreland argues that even if all near-death experiences are false and they're all made up by people to get girls and money and fame, Moreland still argues that they tell us what we are or what we conceive of ourselves to be. Okay? That we're more than our brains, that we're centers of consciousness that can float around, switch bodies, be reincarnated, that type of thing. All right? So, pause it right here and look at this. And Moreland argues if some of these near-death experiences are true, then it does confirm that physicalism is false and that some form of dualism is true. Secondly, it does show that life after death is possible for at least as long as the longest near-death experience ever experienced. Okay? Now, what do you think? Can it show that life after death continues for eternity? As some might think so, if some of their Christian hypotheses were confirmed and they see Jesus or something like that. But you be the judge, work it out yourself. Let's talk about it. All right, final exam. We got to learn our metaphysics, review physicalism and materialism. That's just only matter exists. Humans are purely physical entities. Types of dualism: property dualism, so there's non-physical mental states, colors, sensations, different than the brain states properties, and substance dualism, which says there's a self or an atman that exists that has these mental properties, and this is the kind of thing that could survive bodily death or be reincarnated. All right. Now, no other scientific argument for against immortality is not scientific. It's philosophical, from physicalism, and from naturalism. But it's assuming naturalism is true. Now, if you can show that our dualist intuitions are false and physicalism is true, then I think that yes, that is evidence against the afterlife. Unless God, well, again, it's not. So this argument is kind of neutralized. So my Christian friends who are physicalists, they think God just takes that thumb drive, shoves it in your brain, so to speak, and then just downloads your memories, your personality traits into your new body and the afterlife. All right. So you be the judge of that. Know Mike's plan for exploring the issue. I think we should look at philosophy, look at these arguments, look at, see if God exists, or if it's probable God exists, see if God spoke anywhere and revealed truths anywhere, and then check, yeah, Jesus was who he said he was, and see if we have some experiences. I don't mention experiences like my grandfather. I should, though. So maybe you're up to these maybe experiential things. You know, what can we know by watching people die? And I know a lot of you guys are nurses, and a lot of us have seen family members die, and maybe you can glean something from those moments. I've had students have near-death experiences themselves. I've had students see, one of my friends, she said she saw her dad talk to somebody, like clear as day, and then like 10 minutes before he died. It was just bizarre because he went to lose it for 2 days before that, and things like that. And also be able to talk about the importance of the issue. And I think keep an eye out, like in film and literature and media. I love Dave Matthews' band because Dave Matthews is consumed about this existential question of death and meaning and purpose in life. I like that he spends time on it. So, check it out. Beyond Death. J.P. Moreland, I think that's a great book to check out. He explores reincarnation and does some case studies where he thinks they need to be explained. And he gives arguments for dualism, and he gives brief arguments for scripture and that kind of thing. All right, so that's a nice philosophical exploration of death with Gary Habermas. All right. One of my favorite scenes is the death of Boromir in the Fellowship of the Ring. I remember seeing this. I cried the first 10 times I watched it. I just thought it was fantastic. So, who we are and how we die. In my other class at Xavier, we're reading Plato's Phaedo. And we were discussing last week about what does a person of good character do as he or she dies. Anyway, that's it. It's the 29th of March, 2015. Coming to you from Mason, Ohio. Here's the grandma. It's 101. This is tougher.